Hello, and welcome to everybody. It's 12 o'clock. It's one of the first sessions of this year's Vienna Humanities Festival. And as you know, this year is about revolution. And we are going to talk about one of the revolutions that is in a certain way the most visible these days, but it's more difficult to understand. And this is to what extent internet, new technologies are going to change the world. And I do believe that from this point of view, we have a speaker who in many ways are best prepared to give us at least a glimpse how it can look like. Because normally on technology, people are invited to speak technology people. And technology people can be very exciting, but they're not always understandable outside of their own community. So Scott Carpenter, whom I know for many years, is the director of Jigsaw Google, but he's not coming from technology world. He has been one of the top American diplomats, and he basically migrated to Google some 7 years ago. And in the way he was telling me, for him, moving from the Department of State to Google was a much more of a cultural shock than coming from the United States to Bulgaria in the early 1990s. So what I'm planning to do is the following. First, I want to ask him basically to say what he's doing in Google and why they're doing this, because from a certain point of view, the perspective that he's going to introduce is very different than the perspective normally you have, because in Google, he's the head of a unit which is trying to correct some of the problems that technology has created. But he's much better positioned to tell the story of what they're doing and why they're doing before we move to the bigger world.
All right, thank you so much, Ivan. And I just want to thank you and Desi and the festival for the invitation to come and speak here. It's not often that I get a chance to get away from the day-to-day work that I'm doing to reflect on how it is that the work going on in my world is shaping everything that we do. So a little bit about Jigsaw. That's the name of the unit within Alphabet, which is part of, Alphabet is the company that owns Google, and it also owns Jigsaw. We work very closely with Google. We were born out of Google, and our name Jigsaw is related to the concept of a jigsaw puzzle. So in a jigsaw puzzle, the most fun is throwing all the pieces out onto the table and then working with others to put the puzzle together as it slowly takes form. And occasionally, a piece falls from the table. And that missing piece is what Jigsaw is looking for, together with others. Because as the digitization of the world has taken place, there are a lot of missing pieces, and trying to understand how they fit together in this digitized world, and recognizing the danger if we don't address and find those pieces is part of why Jigsaw exists. So our team is a team of technologists, software engineers, product managers, that works with technology to try to address, as Ivan was saying, some of the problems that are created through technology. So one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is these things. All right, now, how many of you have them in this room? Well, let me ask it easier to see. How many of you don't have them? All right. So very few people don't have them. And when were these invented? Anybody know? When were these invented? I'm sorry? 2007. So we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the creation of what we call the smartphone. How many people now have these things? Close to 2 billion. 2 billion. 2 billion in 10 years. That's how fast this technology has spread. And with it, everything else that's associated with this technology. All of the translation apps, the mapping apps, the social media apps. There are 2 billion people on Facebook. There are 1.7 billion people who have Gmail. YouTube is the most used platform in the world at the moment. And in the time that I've been talking, about 7 million videos have been uploaded to Google's servers. So it's not just about the technology, it's about the scale of that technology. And one of the things that happens when technology spreads as fast as it does is human institutions, human culture does not change as fast as the technology spreads. And so there are a lot of questions about what happens when technologies like these completely change and alter the way we interact with one another and our societies. And so what Jigsaw tends to look at is the security challenges that arise from the spread of this technology, but also how those security challenges are reflected in ways that we don't typically think about. So it's not just about keeping your email secure, but it's about how do people who are looking to create social change, for instance, how does the work that they do change when they are able to be harassed online to such an extent that they have to leave the conversation? What happens to publishers around the world that are trying to tell their story, and at the most critical moment, when the story is the most important for people to access it, they are taken offline by a type of digital attack called a DDoS attack? What happens when violent extremists are able to leverage these technologies to spread their views and organize in such a way that it poses a threat to all of us? My team at Jigsaw looks at these sorts of issues, and I'd be interested in talking about that more in the Q&A part of our discussion.
Thank you very much. Because there are two questions concerning the digital revolution. One is where this revolution is going. Basically, there is a lot of projections how in the next 10 years the things are going to change. For example, there was a study being done with the 100 leading specialists on artificial intelligence around the world. And they asked them to give the time horizon in which they do believe certain type of things are going to develop. And just give you one example of what they do believe. Of course, this is projections. They do believe in the year 2024. This is 7 years from now. Basically, we are going to have translation. The machines are going to translate better from one language to another than the human being. So imagine how, just to give you an idea how radical it is. All my life, I was teaching my kids that the only thing that we really can give them in life and which is going to help them all the time is to learn foreign languages. Imagine that in 10 years, on your telephone, when you meet everybody in the world, the telephone is going to work as your personal interpreter. How this is going to change the world. I'm saying this because there was an Oxford philosopher, Floridi, who basically believes that what the revolution that we're facing now is the internet, and he's calling this as the fourth revolution, can be compared only with the 3 revolutions in human history before. First, he said, was the Copernicus, and this is when the human beings understood that we are not at the center of the universe. And then came Darwin, who basically helped us to understand where we stay in the animal world. And then basically came Freud, who basically destroyed the idea of the totally rational nature of the human mind. And now he said, with the fourth revolution, with the internet, what is in question is, what is our view of reality? What is real? What is not real? What is the shared reality? And I'm asking this because I know that one thing that Scott and his colleagues are working very much is the internet created a situation in which we are more connected than ever before, but strangely enough, we are less exposed to people who do not think like us. The CO effect is very well known now and basically being studied. And I do believe that they believe that part of this problem was very much based that you have a technology that allows you just to read what you want to read, and they're trying to have the technological response how to do it. And I do believe it's quite important because, for example, for somebody coming from political science, it's critically important how this is changing the world of politics. And I do believe that Scott has certain observation how it works, at least in the United States.
Yes, well, there is a lot packed into the comments that Ivan has just made, but I'll make one simple point and then maybe talk about a couple of other things. For those of us who have worked very closely in the past with interpreters, interpreters are not translators. Interpreters are not translators. Machines are going to be extraordinarily good at translating, right? Maybe even so good that you can have your Bluetooth in your ear, and when somebody is speaking in whatever language they're speaking in, you're hearing it in your language. So the babble fish of Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will become a reality, and probably sooner rather than later. But translation is not interpretation. Interpretation requires a deep nuance understanding of culture, both the culture of the person who's speaking and the culture of the person who's listening. And in my experience, that is not something that machines will be able to do. AI is really good at allowing and enabling machines, when enough data is provided, I mean a lot of data, to identify patterns. But patterns are not nuanced, and patterns can't react to facial expressions from people who are in the audience, for instance. So for our ability as human beings to continue to interact with one another, we can't. Machines can maybe help us in some ways, but they should not be able to get in the way. And so that's one point that I just think is important to make. The other point to make is about knowledge. What is knowledge? So Google search took advantage of something that we as human beings do a lot. We ask questions. We are curious. We want to know. We are all searching for something. There is something that's part of who we are as human beings that is looking for something. And where do you look for it? Today you look for it on your favorite search engine, whatever it is, Bing, Yahoo, maybe Google, and you put a search term in there. What the challenge is that initially when you were getting your results back, that information was derived from how many other people were linking to those connections, right? So the deep links of one thing to another. That didn't necessarily represent knowledge. It was information, but that information could be biased or wrong. And so there's been this whole question around how do we understand knowledge? What is knowledge? And so one of the interesting things you'll note in Google search these days is when you search for anything, on the right-hand side, so you get all the raw links. But on the right-hand side, you also get what we call the knowledge panel. And the knowledge panel is typically right now Wikipedia, but it also has other elements to it. If you're searching for this topic, maybe look at this other thing, these other topics that are related to it. Trying to recreate, for those of us of a different generation who used to walk into the library and look at the card catalog number and go to the stacks looking for the book that we thought we wanted, and then the book that we really wanted that we didn't even know we wanted was 2 books over. How do we recreate that serendipity of finding and identifying new ideas, things that we didn't expect in a serendipitous way? Technology companies and firms are now understanding that there is a deep responsibility for how we construct the algorithms that we're using to serve our users. So one of the challenges with, let's say, Facebook or some other social networks is that they have placed a certain value within their algorithms on likes, for instance. What that does is it creates this internal silo, because what you like, they provide more of what you like, and you like it more, and you like it more. And the people who like it also like you. And all of a sudden, everybody you're interacting with likes exactly what you like, says exactly what you say, thinks exactly like you think. And we recognize that that is not a good thing, not normatively. It's not a good thing normatively. We should have exposure to other ideas. And we should find ways of using technology to help people understand those or have access to those ideas. In the West, broadly speaking, where institutions and cultures, political cultures are well established, this presents a certain type of challenge to our societies. But one of the areas that we really think a lot about is, what about all those places in the world where institutions are either weak or non-existent, where conflict is a daily reality, where authoritarianism is a daily reality? What then? How are these technologies being used in those cases? What happens? We are slowly adjusting to this, but all of us live our lives in two places, online and offline. One is not more real than the other one. They are integrated. But what happens in places where you've lived through an authoritarian nightmare, and you think about where do you get the news from that you trust in an authoritarian context, Yvonne? Do you trust the state-run media? No. So who do you trust? You trust your friends. You trust your neighbors who are telling you what's really going on. What is that called? It's called the rumor mill. What happens when that culture goes through a transition where that same trust network immediately goes from offline to online? You have what's happening in Myanmar right now, where one Buddhist monk, a very radical Buddhist monk, used Facebook to talk about how a group of Rohingya killed a grandmother on a bicycle in this small village. That news spread like wildfire online and led to what is this incipient genocide in Myanmar. So we want to better understand not only what's happening in our cultures where our institutions are more grounded, but what about places in the world where institutions are not well grounded? And what about those places in the world where technology can be used to oppress as well as liberate?
Thank you very much. I just want to continue in this. First of all, thinking about Facebook and likes, we used to talk about like-minded people. Now we should probably talk about likes-minded people. But I'm saying this because also what normally we know is that something is changing a lot, but the most difficult to see is what is changing in our own life and professions. Listen, I'm a political scientist by training, and I can tell you that in the next 10 years, my profession is going to be totally transformed by the big data, to the extent that you cannot imagine. Just give you an idea on the methodological level. How we worked in the social science that you know it. We normally had a theory, hypothesis. Then we basically construct a sample. And on the base of this sample, we are trying to verify our theory. Is it right? Is it wrong? And basically we come with an explanation which we are selling to the society. With the big data, you don't need theory. Big data is coming with patterns. So as a result of it, we are going to have a much higher level of predictability. Probably we are going to be better positioned to predict how the Austrian elections are going to end up. The only problem is that nevertheless that we're going to know who is going to win, we cannot tell you why. Social sciences are going totally to lack their power to explain. And as a result, you're going to be shocked. But as a result, political scientists and social scientists are going to lose a lot of their power. Because giving explanations, you're giving meaning. Now you're going to have a prediction, but you're not going to give a meaning. And I do believe this goes for different professions. Imagine, for example, I'm Bulgarian. In my own country, 20 years ago, legal profession and basically lawyers have been perceived as the profession of the future. We said we're living in such a complex world, there's so much business and so on, you need lawyers. Now we're already talking about the major companies in which basically they start firing their lawyers because there are going to be algorithms who are going to work on this type of legal decisions. There was a profession 100 years ago in this city, one of the most kind of fascinating profession, if you're a young girl coming from not a very rich family, was to be a stenographer. It was a great profession. You go there and probably even you're going to marry a rich man. Because now probably some of you don't know what stenography is. And I'm saying this because imagine how difficult it is going to be to plan our lives and how difficult it is to be a parent in a situation like this, in which you cannot imagine the world in your kids are going to live. So from this point of view, my last question before going to your question is the following. When you're staying in Google, because from this point of view, you're not a kind of, I'm commenting, but you're doing reality. I'm going to ask one very abstract, but for me critical questions. What you fear and what you hope for being inside the animal?
I think obviously it's easier to talk about what people fear. And as somebody who their entire lives and their entire career has been in some shape or form been related to human freedom and promoting human freedom and safeguarding human freedom, I am concerned about the way in which certain governments could use these tools to obstruct our ability to communicate, share experiences, live a pluralistic, within a pluralistic framework where we can't even identify that pluralism. We can't talk about that pluralism. We can't recognize it. I am concerned that in some countries of the world where a monopoly is held on the very tools that are used to generate this big data, that in those places there's a specific type of nightmare that could be coming. I think in general, my hope is that there is going to be this amazing, fruitful collaboration between human beings with all their creativity, with all of their skill, with all of their hopes, with all their desires. And that collaboration is going to take place with machines. We're already doing it. You're already doing it, right? The collaboration, the speed, the sense of being able to accomplish, to learn, to grow, to have questions answered quickly, to be able to interact with people who are very, very different from you in ways that you can't possibly imagine right now. And all of this is not going to be, this is a hope, as I said. This is not going to strip you of your identity or individuality. It's going to accentuate it and allow you to experience things that you would never have thought possible before. We're talking about certain technologies like AI, or in our case, deep learning, which is a kind of subset of artificial intelligence. Deep learning as a technology is one thing, but what happens when you start to combine it with other things? Where you have convergence around robotics, when you have convergence around virtual reality, when you have convergence around some of these other technologies that are still in their relative infancy, but are going to be profoundly impacted by the revolution that's taken place in machine learning, deep learning over the past 2 or 3 years. So my hope is that this is going to unleash, as one of my friends here in the audience has called it, a digital renaissance in a way, where we are able as individuals to engage in a much deeper way with the world around us in ways that we haven't been freed up to do in the past. So that's my hope.
Thank you very much. I'll go to your question. Just one observation, because there was an event being organized some days ago by Dmitry Aksionov. What struck me is to what extent the basic ethical questions are coming back. There was a time in which, in a certain way, we were not very much asking ourselves what are going to be the long-term implications of what we are doing, of the decisions that we are taking. And I was very much surprised by Nobel Prize winner in physics or conductor and so on, starting to go for, after every new technology, to ask basic ethical questions that the world has not been asking probably after the atomic bomb came in 1945. In a certain way, there was a moment in which we had the feeling that the moral space in a certain way known to us. And now you start asking questions, what we should do and what we should not do and so on. So this type of a dimension for me is also quite important. But please, we have 25 minutes for your questions, and please. I'm sorry, let me do like this.
Two researchers at Stanford recently published a paper in which they developed a CNN which could differentiate between heterosexuals and homosexuals with a success rate of over 80%, using only a single image. China is also increasingly using face recognition technology en masse for various monitoring purposes. It's possible to imagine some other applications of machine learning which authoritarian regimes would very much like to exploit. Can tech companies and governments in democratic countries work together to do anything to prevent the use of machine learning for authoritarian purposes?
So I think it's going... So first of all, governments love to be able to get as much information as they possibly can on everybody in order to keep bad people from doing bad things. So there is always this institutional desire that companies and others have to resist in the I would say in democratic countries. There is this fine balance. We have these procedures that are set up for subpoenas and the ability to get data in legal ways from private companies. Your question is, are there ways in which authoritarian governments can use technology in ways of repressing people? Of course, of course. So many of you, some of you, have read the book The Circle. How many people have read this book? All right, in this book, I'll just give you a quick synopsis. In this book, it imagines a company in Silicon Valley that
much resembling Google and Facebook,
that come together with a company that very much resembles Twitter, and they form this one big company, and it's called The Circle. And the company is able to leverage all of its data to basically serve its users. This big company with all this data. And in the end, because transparency is so important, they encourage transparency in politics. The company encourages transparency in politics. And the way they do it is they encourage one member of Congress who's running for re-election to wear a camera around their necks for every meeting that they go into. So that it's totally transparent. Right? Totally transparent. And then, because the other person's not doing it, they say, hey, you're not doing this. So eventually, this company gets to see everything that's happening, right? And they're able to see even the things that the politicians don't want them to see, because nobody lives a fully transparent life. So it's about political control. They control everything. I read the book and I found it a little bit ridiculous in our context, in a Western democratic context. If you transplant this to a place like China, where you are able to have that, where companies like Facebook, like Twitter, like Google all exist, but where by law the national security establishment sits inside the companies, where they have access to the data. You can begin to imagine what the censorship and surveillance state could come to look like. And already in China, with facial recognition technology, you have cameras that are identifying jaywalkers, people who are crossing the street where they're not supposed to, based on their photo IDs, and sending them tickets. So the possibilities for this are endless, and I think that the dialogue has to continue to take place in democratic countries with the institutions that exist to make sure that these technologies are not being used in that way. I think for both Google and Facebook, for instance, we've been very careful with facial technology and how we deploy them in our products. If you have Google Photos and you are uploading a lot of your photos to Google Photos, you identify people like your brother, your father, your mother, or whatnot, you can enter their names and you can create that, and then the machine can help you identify all those photos, but that's something that you control, not us.
Just one question, just one point which was interesting. 5 or 6 years ago, if you remember all the talk about technologies, all the democratic governments were totally excited that new technologies are going to empower people, and basically they're going to empower democracies. There was this talk about liberation technologies. Now you see totally different type of atmosphere, and one of the stories is that one of the major structural problem of any authoritarian regime is an access to authentic information. One of the interesting impact of the technologies is there is no need for police informers anymore. People are basically informing on themselves on a daily basis. You're telling what you're doing, with whom you're doing, why you're doing, and so on. So I'm saying this because the very understanding of politics, repression, anywhere, is going totally to change. But there was a question there, sorry for...
It's actually on a different issue, but I'm just interested what your point is on that, because will have an impact on workforce, on the way we work, and when comparing like in the 1970s with Google now having a comparable turnover, annual turnover, but the workforce is, I don't know, 1/3 or something about that. So I'm wondering how we can deal with this in the future, because there was always the tale, okay, new jobs will come up, but actually that doesn't seem to be the case at the same scale. And so I'm wondering if now politics or how state is structured, if we can deal with that appropriately, or if there will be, like when you compare it with Industrial Revolution in 19th century or beginning 20th century, if we will face something similar to that. So what are your ideas about that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. It's a question that I think a lot of us get. Because it is true that there has been a lot of concentration of wealth, for instance, in Silicon Valley, and that, you know, if you look at the 10 largest companies in the world by market capitalization, they're all American and they're all technical. They're all tech companies. And so I think there is this concern, first of all, on equality, like what all this massive concentration of wealth. There's a whole social, political conversation to be had about that. Then the second piece is related to this question about employment. What are people going to do when the machines take over? That's the kind of way it's phrased, typically. I think it's way too early to tell. Way too early to tell. I think it's true that some professions are going to be very easily the tasks that are done are going to be taken over. But let's not glorify those tasks either. I mean, some of them, like stenography, was not the most glorious job in the world to do. It was a job. And work, we know, it goes far beyond what you're paid. So the idea of a guaranteed income is not something that I find particularly helpful, because work is about so much more than that. It's about dignity and having a sense of purpose in your life. So for me, I think it's too early to tell. Certain jobs, yes, definitely will be eliminated. I do think new jobs will come, but the big question is whether we'll be able to adjust more quickly. Will we be able to adjust more quickly than in the Industrial Revolution? I think so. Other people think not. They're like, how could that possibly be? I think because of this collaboration between human beings and machines, I think we'll be able to create whole new ways of doing things in whole different places. Like, so far, there's been this huge concentration of talent and resources, etc., inside cities. It's just pulling people to the cities. Does that necessarily have to remain the case with all these new technologies? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe there are distribution ways. Maybe the inner artist in us is able to be unleashed in a different way. One of the things I was looking at this morning, there's a website that you can go and look live for what happens on the internet in 1 second. So how many YouTube videos are uploaded, how many Google searches in 1 second. And then you can wait, and it'll show you like in 1 minute and 10 minutes or whatnot. But Tumblr, everybody know what Tumblr is? Okay, Tumblr is a self-blogging platform. I was shocked this morning when I did this. From Vienna, so not in 1 second, there were 8,000 new Tumblrs in 1 second. That means that in 1 second, people are self-creating content, writing. I don't know who they're talking to, I don't know what kind of interaction it is, but the idea that this creative process is taking place and people have the time and desire to do it is something that I find encouraging at some levels. So I don't know the precise answer. I just think that we are, I think it's too soon to know. I think that the idea that this is all going to be disrupted in the next 5 years is pessimistic. I think that this is going to take a lot longer in most industries. What is definitely true, is that knowledge and skills are going to be preeminent. Like, education becomes even more critical, and the question of disrupting the academy and institutions, it has to happen. The academic institutions around the world are some of the most conservative, and it really, to prepare young people for this new world in terms of how flexible, creative, long-term learning, all of these things are going to be critically important going forward.
Thank you very much. Because I see several questions, let's take them so everybody can have the opportunity.
Actually, it's interesting you finished with what I was going to ask. As a mother of 2 children, I'm really lost. How do you continue education in school nowadays when all the answers are for the kids ready there? And, you know, for them to understand that there is translation and interpretation, it takes time and life experience. So as parents, with this quite old-fashioned schools now, what do we do? How do we adjust? I mean, how to educate children so they know how to do interpretation in the future and not translation? Thank you.
There was one more question there, so my idea is you have to take it and then.
I feel like you didn't really address so much about how bad it is, the things that authoritarian regimes could do with pervasive surveillance and machine learning, but rather what Western companies and governments then should be doing in the face of the certain knowledge that the techniques they develop to allow you to have your face turned into an animated poo emoji, for example, can and absolutely will then be used to survey populations, control their movements. Google control, and to some extent that's true, but of course it's not true that you have control over which companies put Google ad JavaScript things on their pages and track you where you're going, and it's not true that data mining companies like Equifax will then buy consumer data from everyone else and create these huge data sets that then can be stolen and used for other purposes. So what responsibility do companies bear for the inevitable negative misuse of the technologies, and what steps can then we take aside from saying, yes, it's a shame that these things are going to happen?
If there is no more, I'm going to add also one question on myself so you can end answering all of us. But one of the interesting stories that I found out is, Valentina said about education, but the government is not controlling, does not lose monopoly over education. Companies like yours, in fact, are becoming the biggest educational institution. So how you're going to use your power? The same is about how others are using your technologies. I'm asking this because for me, one of the most striking effects of the technology revolution is that we started better to understand some of the rationale of our own institutions. For example, I was never a great friend of transparency, as basically Scott knows, for a very simple reason. How we are calling our vote secret ballot. It was secrecy that was empowering us to a certain extent, and you need a certain level of secrecy of the individual in order basically to keep this autonomous individual. So for me, the most interesting is how this culture that is coming from Silicon Valley and these big technology companies that 5 or 10 years ago looks that it empowers citizens, starts now to empower governments or other big non-state actors, or even kind of a terrorist organization. So I mean, what is the thinking within the company?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to close on the question of education because I think that's a longer answer. Look, what can the companies do together with the governments? So Google publishes something called the Transparency Report. The Transparency Report comes out, I think, once a month, and it records every request that we've received from government for our data. And includes the disposition of whether or not we gave that data to the government or we did not give that data to the government. We have to work on processes with governments as to what they can access and when they can access it. So laws have to be passed, and those laws have to catch up with what's going on. But the fact is that today, CCTV cameras are absolutely everywhere, and Google's not running those cameras. Those are your local governments, your federal governments that are running those cameras, and those feeds are constantly running everywhere around here. Probably, I bet there are 100 of them just in this square alone watching people. But the thing is, no one looks at that film, nobody looks at that footage unless and until there's something bad that happens. And then governments, if they identify somebody, they want to know who that person is. And they want to use every tool at their disposal to get to know who that person is. And that's when a lot of these very difficult, thorny questions come into play. Governments are also developing facial recognition technology. This is not just the companies, because all it takes is access to data and a lot of photos. Guess who has a lot of photos, ladies and gentlemen? Your governments. Think about your photos. How many of you have a driver's license in this room? How many of your pictures are on that driver's license? How many pictures are on your passports that you carry around with you? Where are all those images? Who has those images? Every time you go through a border, you're scanning your passport these days. It knows where you are, where you've been, where it's all integrated. Governments have all of this information. It's not, the companies aren't sharing this, we're resisting it. But when something happens on those in the vision of those CCTV cameras, they're going to use all of that information, and you don't have any say as to whether or not your privacy is compromised in that instant. So I think that there are conversations that we need to have as societies, democratic societies, about where this is going. But I don't think that this is the responsibility entirely of the tech companies. Where we put our efforts is in fighting subpoenas. And a lot of people are upset that we fight subpoenas. Don't you want to help catch the bad guy? But what happens when you start saying automatically, here, you just file a request, and if you're the FBI, we'll just give you the information you want? We just don't think that that's the right way to go about handling the trust that users are giving us. Because if we lose the trust, people leave. After the Snowden leaks, Google took an enormous hit around the world. And we were very upset. And it led us to do certain things to further harden our infrastructure. And guess who didn't like that? A lot of democratically elected governments around the world. So I understand that we are fearful about certain types of activity, terrorist activity, etc. There was a recent, I know this is not a defense, but there was a recent story that there were 12,700 ISIS videos that remained on Google's platforms on YouTube 24 hours after we had been alerted to the fact that they were there. 12,700. Sounds like an enormous amount, right? But I just told you that 7 million are uploaded to our servers every 1 minute. So just in this, it's a needle in a haystack in some ways. We find those. We'll get them down within 48 hours. But I think that we have to have a sense of balance and understanding of what's actually happening. Second very quick point. Everything that we're concerned about in terms of crossing the data streams already happens. Already happens. So Equifax and Amazon and so for advertising, for political advertising in particular in the United States, people have access to this data legally. You can get access to the data, not to you as an individual, but to, various demographic profiles, etc. And you can advertise very specifically. I don't know whether those things are going to change as a result of conversation that's taking place. But again, I think that this is something that has to emerge from conversations with society about what we want to have happen. If you are concerned about any of this, get off the platforms. Get off the platforms. Or as another friend of ours, Ivan Zeman, last week said, he takes great joy in confusing Amazon's algorithm. It can't predict what he likes because he's so different and he has so many different likes. So, but that's unfortunately the choice that you have. You either participate and or socialize and understand what's going on in the world and interacting with this technology. You adopt some other kind of mode for yourself personally about what your interaction is going to be with this digital world, or you choose to just completely stay off of it. And by the way, increasing number of younger people are doing that. They're just not going there. Education. Again, this is a lot, please recognize that a lot of this is my opinion. It's not like, this is not sanctioned Google position. I'm deeply frustrated with the educational institutions as they exist because of especially around certification. Who gets to issue diplomas, all right? That's where the state has the control. They get to say, you have reached a certain state where you get your master's degree, your PhD, your Bachelor of Arts degree, your Bachelor's of Science degree. But the amazing access that we have today, that your kids have today, to the best lecturers, the best education on the planet is available online. Things like the Khan Academy, where you can self-serve lectures, like you can take a class, audit a class at Stanford in whatever you want. You have access to that for free, right? But the problem is that at the end of the day, they're not allowed to give you a diploma. And in the United States, they don't want to give you a diploma because they want you to pay a lot of money for these services. So I think one of the dialogues that has to take place is that your education at your local school is coming out of a certain culture that needs to probably evolve and change, adapt to what the needs of the workforce is. In the United States, we still go to school based on an agricultural calendar. We still go to school based on an agricultural calendar. We force young boys to get up and go to school at 6:30 in the morning, like in their high school, in their teenage years. Why? They need sleep. They need to grow. Their brains aren't awake then. Why are we doing this? We don't have to do this. In every other area of the economy, we're using technology to make our lives more flexible, not in education. So I think that there's a lot that's ripe for disruption in the education area. The challenge is that you have to fulfill all these obligations that they are creating for you, or you can't move on. And I think that a lot of autodidacts, this era is a joyous one. There's been nothing like it ever in the history of humanity. But for those who have to go through this process to get a degree that may or may not be useful at the end of the day is a bit ridiculous.
Thank you very much. I want us to thank Scott. First, because in my view, at least for me, it was interesting. Secondly, for 36 hours, he decided to fly from New York to speak in front of you, and tomorrow he is flying back. I also want to end up on a very optimistic note, which is uncharacteristic for me. I was on a panel discussion with Snowden some weeks ago. He was through Skype, and he was saying very grimly that never in human life human beings have been so much observed and surveilled like now. And I'm optimistic because this is not true. You have forgotten that there was a time when people believed in God, and God was seeing everything, including our intentions. So from this point of view, we are better anyway. So thank you very much, and time should